I think we can start. I first want to seriously welcome you to the new school, Parsons, and let you know a little bit of the reasons that we're trying to organize this. I know you got a chance to read on this mass spamming that we sent about. We're starting 2 new graduate programs at this place, which we think are really working to redefining the possibilities of pedagogy around urban practice. And for us it's very important to start building an idea, a public idea of what we're talking about, and this pre-series from the inaugural moment, which is September to 12. Is for us very important in presenting a lot of people, these together with other lectures that we're going to be working around, that have influenced this program a lot. We're talking about a program that, or a series of programs that that are looking more at issues on how the city is being shaped by processes. It's being constructed by a series of social relationships that in very recent times have been coalescing into a great democratic force, which finally is shouting to all of us, it's time to do things differently. We're thinking of these programs as such, trying to work in that other city, those other moments of the city that are not the typical moments that were so sort of put on a pedestal in the 90s, 2000s, etc., which were these great points of concentration of capital. We're talking about those areas of the city, or those moments which are being constructed by democratic organization, by the desire of people to change and reconstruct their own environments to their own will. And we seriously believe that that type of knowledge is very muted in academic apparatus. And so we're really building and trying to very strongly to comprise 2 programs that could allow us to develop and start building a different form of urban knowledge, applicable, active, dynamic, that is dealing with that area of the city that the democratic participation of citizens is crying for. I'm right now, with whole pleasure, presenting Tom Angotti, which I should mention has been one of the main characters and has influenced the construction of this program. Tom is a legend somehow. I'm not sure if you want to call it this. In what's this field of community planning, perhaps following a lot of history that the United States has in the direction of working with communities in the build-up of urban spaces. He's professor in Hunter College, Department of Urban Affairs and Planning in New York City. And he's also the director of the Hunter Center for Community Planning and Development, where he started Sustainability Watch and numerous projects with community-based partners in New York City. He's also an advocate of progressive community planning. Throughout his career, in 2008, he published the New York for Sale, fantastic book I seriously recommend it. With this book, he won this very prestigious prize called Davidoff Prize. He has also written issues on planning, poverty, and politics, and is a prolific writer all over the place, and an incredible participant of community movements in New York and abroad, I think, and a great representative of them. So it is really a pleasure for us to really have you here. Last time he was going to come, he got hit by a bike. So, seriously? By a car, sorry. He was in a bike, hit by a car. Sorry, it's true.
I was on a bike.
Oh, man, it's a long day. Well, but now he's here totally in healthy position, ready to talk to us. So, let's welcome Tom, and yeah, look forward.
Well, thank you, Miguel, and it's great to be here, safe and sound, one piece. I thought I would talk about a couple of things in this order. First, I just want to review what may be to some of you, if you've read New York for Sale, if you know something about community planning in New York, you've already heard this. But I wanted to talk about an important topic, which is public space. And when I wrote about community planning, it was really about reoccupying the commons, gaining control of land, what I call community land. So let me explain that. The second thing then I would like to do is make the connection with the global. And I will give you a sneak preview perhaps of some pieces from my next book, which will be out this summer, called Urban Orientalism, the New Century of the Metropolis. And I think it is doubly important for those of us who live and work in the city and work with the city, that we maintain a global as well as a local, regional, and global perspective. And the failure to do so, I think, leads to, in professional practice, enormous egoisms and failures. So let me explain why that is. I have to say, when I say profession, I was trained as an urban planner, and I've worked as an urban planner for many years. But I don't do traditional urban planning. I do a lot of urban planning. The way I got involved with community planning came out of community organizing, involvement in housing and tenant issues, rent strikes, and somehow wound up getting a PhD in planning because I thought it had something to say. I thought it was a way of blending theory and practice, learning about the city, but also learning how to change the city, and how to deal with bigger issues of local and global and national change. So, so it's so easy in our professions to get lost in the local and to take ourselves out of the context. Now, when I say that, very often people say, oh, well, yeah, but you can't just talk about global issues all the time. You'll bore people to death, and that's not what they care about. People care about their communities, they care about their neighborhoods, they want affordable housing, they want better public spaces and all of those things. So what's with the global issues? You can't come in with the global issues all the time. Well, you have to. Otherwise, you will end up missing the political target. And you will be blind to some of the deeper social, racial, class issues that affect everything that we do as professionals. So anyway, let me take these first two steps. First talk about community planning in New York. And the way I got involved was by actually working with community-based organizations, and as a technical advisor, because I knew something about physical planning, about zoning, and how the city operates, and how you can get things done. And after working with several community-based plans, first in Red Hook, Williamsburg, Sunset Park, any number of other communities around the city, I discovered that there were close to 100 community-based plans. And this is in a city, the city that calls itself the real estate capital of the world, which has never had a comprehensive plan, has never had a master plan. Unlike Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, just about every other major city in the country, and most other major cities in the world. Now, that's not saying that if you have a master plan, it means anything. but it expresses some interest in having a public vision of the future of the city. New York never had that. Yet New York is this vital city, and it's very active, and it grew and it developed, and lo and behold, the city that never had a master plan has the largest mass transit system in the United States. So you say, what do you need a plan for? Well, stop glorifying the mass transit system. If you've lived here long enough, you know that practically nothing new has been built in this mass transit system for the last 50 years. It's getting more expensive and unsustainable, and it's revaluing itself only because the real estate industry has discovered that it needs this mass transit system. So they invented what's called transit-oriented development, which means maximize development around subway stations, increase the value of land by building around the subway station so you don't have to build any other mass transit. And you can reduce the funding for buses, which is not transit-oriented development, of course. So the existence of mass transit, of a very dense city, which has certain advantages and certain efficiencies, were all unintended consequences of the rule of real estate. And this is the city where real estate has ruled. When there was first a proposal to do a comprehensive plan, Andrew Haskell Green, who was one of the prime promoters of Central Park, a planned open space, probably the largest planned open space in the city, also had the idea of doing a comprehensive plan. In the early 20th century, that was blown out of the water by the real estate industry, downtown interests, who felt that building a subway system was a better way to lay out the city, aside from the grid plan from the previous century, which was essentially not a plan. It was a subdivision. It was a surveyor's plan to lay out large portions of Manhattan. So some of the good things that we all know and love and about New York City were unintended consequences of real estate rule. And that rule was only reinforced in the last 20 years with the greater concentration of real estate capital in Manhattan in particular, but increasingly in development nodes outside the center of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Long Island City, Jersey City. In fact, there are 12 nodes of finance and real estate development in the New York metropolitan region, and Manhattan is no longer the sole CBD, Central Business District. So this was a long digression by way of saying that community-based planning has flourished in the last 50 years in New York City, in the very city that's self-designated as the real estate capital of the world. And why? And that led me to think about and to write about this dilemma, this paradox. More than just about any other major city, you have a centuries-long tradition of very vibrant and active community-based organizations, the largest tenant movement in the country, and it's in the backyard of the most powerful real estate industry. And the two must be related in one way or the other. And it comes about because the desire to develop your own plan comes about because you discover that you don't have control over the land where you live and where you work, and that somebody else is coming in to buy up the land and displace you, dispossess you. And so the history of real estate development historically is, the real estate industry has the phrase, if you take Real Estate 101, location, location, location. Well, the other part of that is dislocation, dislocation, dislocation. That's what happens to our neighborhoods. When investors move in and they buy up land whose potential future value is much greater than its present value, speculate on it and build on it. If you are paying low rents, you can't stay because the investor can't get a return on that money. So what do? You fight against displacement. And that's the history of social movements in New York City for the last century, is fighting against being displaced from the place where you live and work. And it happened in the early part of the century when there was an economic boom and new investment in parts of New York City, mostly in Manhattan, that pushed people out. And that's when we had a massive tenant organization and the beginning of rent control. Because we begin to see the pattern. In the city that has the most powerful real estate industry, we have the only city in the United States that has had rent control continuously for over a century. There's something to that. Now, how do you explain that? It can't be that just an accident. It happens because of the contradictions generated by this powerful real estate industry. Now, some of those contradictions come from within real estate and within capital, within the finance industry. For example, if all of the buildings on Park Row have to hire maintenance people, and the maintenance people have to get to work, they need a mass transit system. But if they have to travel too far, the cost of that labor is going to go way up. So finance capital has a vested interest in reducing the reproduction costs of the labor force, a portion of the labor force, the portion of the labor force that they need in order to protect their investments. So that's also how you explain that New York City, that has this really vibrant, dynamic real estate industry, has the largest collection of public housing in the country. And that for years has maintained a public housing system that avoided all of the sins and violations that other public housing authorities had engaged in over the years, because they disinvested and they didn't manage the apartments well. Well, that's a contradiction internal to finance capital. Another great contradiction: New York City has the largest collection of its own affordable housing programs, even low-income housing programs, although they're the incomes are moving up very quickly these days. You can only explain that as a contradiction. The more luxury housing you have, the more you require, the more they require, low-cost service sector. Not too low cost, and not too high cost, obviously. So this is an enormous set of contradictions that gets worked out through negotiations within the fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, and between the fire sector and other sectors of the economy, and between public and private and organized labor. Since the decline of organized labor in New York over the last 30 or 40 years, relative decline, and the decline of manufacturing with outsourcing and globalization and all of these other trends, that has opened up more space for new real estate development, particularly on the waterfront. The city's waterfront plan is really an attempt to capture the value of real estate on the waterfront, and yet there's and that has pushed out, continued to push out industry and push out low-cost housing, contributing to gentrification of neighborhoods that you know, Greenpoint, Williamsburg, Long Island City, and the Lower East Side, among others. So, community planning, now all of this is a way, is a preface to the idea of community planning. Why? Because the first thing that people think when they hear about community planning is that it's a nice exercise for people in grassroots democracy. That people in neighborhoods get together one fine evening and come together and say, now, we need to have a plan for our neighborhood. Wouldn't it be nice? And they put a call out and send out emails, and the hall fills, and they have a discussion. What are the strengths and weaknesses? And if you've seen strategic planning scenarios, this all sounds familiar. What are the strengths and weaknesses of our community? What are our problems? How can we improve the quality of life in our neighborhood? And let's come up with some proposals and projects, and then reach consensus. And we all know that consensus is, of course, a good thing. And once we've reached consensus, we can all go home happy. Now, that's the fairy tale of community-based planning. Community-based planning that I know comes out of struggles over land. And it comes when communities and neighborhoods find that their neighborhoods are being dumped on because they have a concentration of waste transfer stations, because they have a concentration of truck traffic that's spewing diesel fumes, and they have high levels of asthma. And it's no coincidence that most of those communities and neighborhoods, and most of those who have these kinds of problems, are communities of color. This is a historic pattern that grows out of the segregated landscape in the city. Those neighborhoods that are targets for siting of noxious facilities are typically those neighborhoods where land values are relatively low and there's very little interest by the residential real estate market. Lo and behold, they happen to be communities of color, low-income communities. This is why environmental justice is at the very heart of the community planning movement, and among the strongest advocates of community planning in New York City are the environmental justice advocates. And they come to the idea of doing a community plan not because it's just a nice idea, but because in order to combat the accusations they hear all the time that all you are is parochial. You're not in my backyard, right? So look, the waste transfer station's got to go somewhere, right? You just don't want them in your backyard. Where are we going to put them? They got to go somewhere. And so one of the answers is a more equitable distribution of these noxious facilities. And the plan that we come up with, which is, and almost invariably in these neighborhood and community plans, people accept their fair share of noxious facilities, but are very quick to reject an unfair share of noxious facilities. So the plan is a positive statement. It's a political statement that we too have the right to have a vision for the future of our communities, and that we occupy a space in the city that should not be the dumping ground for all of the waste that other neighborhoods are too quick to reject. And this is where we begin to understand the importance of thinking global, thinking regionally and globally. One of the greatest charges that you will hear from the official planners is that the local plans are just parochial, that they can't think beyond their own turf. I have sat in the meetings with city officials on one side and the activists on the other side. And I've heard the activists cite the numbers and talk about the regional waste system, talk about the citywide solid waste management plan with authority and knowledge, and the Department of Sanitation people on the other side saying, well, look, we just take out the garbage. And we don't know what the commercial carters do because that's not our business. Well, so here we have the necessity coming out of political organizing to develop a larger view, a more regional, global, citywide view, because you can't win without it. And so when I found that we had all of these community-based plans, and the reason I felt it important to write the book was that this represents a significant maturation of our community-based movements and our social movements. Now, social movements come and go all the time. And some will say that that's because they're ephemeral and insignificant. Well, it's in the nature of social movements that they move, that they rise and fall, they take different forms. But if you look at the last century and a half, there has been a progression, and that people have moved, perhaps too slowly, but they've moved from saying, no, we won't move, we will not be displaced, to saying, this is what we do want. It's not just no, but it's yes to all of the things that we consider to be part of a good quality of living in the city. And then the final note on this, I just want to say, is that there's very little space for optimism that this is going to qualitatively change in the near future, because history moves very slowly. It really depends a lot on what activists do and what the professionals do, because by and large, the professionals, the architects, the planners, the designers, are doing what they have to do to make a living. And you can't make a living very well doing community-based planning. Get yourself a tenured professor's job like me, and maybe you can do it. But by and large, it's difficult work, it's time-consuming, it's a lot of meetings. It's not going to change soon, but I'm optimistic that it will change slowly, and that this does represent a maturation over time. I can already see it in the discussions launched over Occupy Wall Street and the way people are dealing with public space in a more sophisticated way than in the past, understanding the complexities of the issues. And so I do think that there's some movement forward, but it's going to be very slow, and it's going to be a very long process. And it's very difficult for North Americans to accept this, because we're always looking for win-win situations. We're always looking for the bright story, the best practice, so that we can also claim that we had a role in it. And there are a lot of setbacks. And there are a lot of neighborhoods and communities that are still being destroyed. We are now facing in New York City the privatization of public housing. That great public housing asset, built starting in the 1930s, the first public housing in the United States, built in New York City, first houses. And in the 1950s, the enormous amount of public housing built with public investment. And there is now a bipartisan agreement that public housing has got to go. This does feed into the greedier section of the real estate industry, because they're running out of space in places like Manhattan. Michael Bloomberg called it the West Midtown, the last great frontier. Indeed, after that, where do they go? Well, public housing is a #1 candidate. This New York City Housing Authority, as we speak, is researching the development potential on public housing sites in New York City. And it's being called the Campaign to Save Public Housing. Okay, how are you going to save it? You're going to save it by bringing in middle and upper income housing and achieving that great utopia of the Hope 6 program, the federal Hope 6 program, which was, yeah, public housing has produced concentrated poverty, so what we have to do is deconcentrate poverty. And how we're going to do that? We're going to tear down all those old, ugly public housing buildings, and we're going to build nice little 2, 3, 4-story new urbanist villages everywhere, and they're going to be mixed incomes. And we already know the results of the first 20 years of Hope 6. It has resulted in a significant net loss of low-income housing units, and the new units have disproportionately become upper income in gentrified neighborhoods. So New York City's plan is to gentrify the public housing units, and the first phase, their utopian dream is that you will have these nice middle-income apartments right next to the low-income apartments, and that gradually they're going to mix in the low-income people with the middle-income people, and it'll be one happy community. This is again these dreams of harmony are made up somewhere else, because I don't see them in our neighborhoods. We have neighborhoods and we have a city of conflict. And community planning is made out of conflict. It starts with conflict and it ends with conflict. And guess what? Conflict's not always bad. And it's especially not bad if the conflict is initiated by people who are oppressed because they've been iced out of decent housing and decent jobs and disrespected and segregated and now told that they have to move. So conflict is okay, but what's going to happen with the housing authority scheme is that the middle income folks are going to move in, and the first thing they're going to do is say, those people are paying their radios too loud. They have to go. No, get rid of them. They're destroying the neighborhood. And you set in motion a dynamic. And because those people haven't had the opportunity to participate in the planning of this new community, they're being told it's going to be in their best interests. And so you're creating conflict. And the result will be yet greater segregation, the development of enclaves. The city is an enclave. And I think that's the direction that we're going. Let me just say the final bit about New York City, because it relates to the next topic I want to talk about briefly, which is the global urbanization. Michael Bloomberg in the last 10 years has earned the reputation internationally as a great mayor of a great city who is doing great things for the environment and is responsible for the growth of the city, saving the infrastructure, creating great public spaces, plazas, bicycle lanes, and he does it professing that New York City is and must be a global center for luxury living. That it's a good thing to have more wealthy people moving into the city, and how dare you suggest that they shouldn't, because that's what makes the city great, is a lot of rich people. So this is the public relations campaign, which of course has migrated from Bloomberg LLC to Bloomberg NYC, is to market the city as a destination, not only for tourism, but for wealthy people, as an arts and cultural center. And the rest of the city will somehow manage because of the trickle-down process. The wealth will trickle down to all of the other neighborhoods. And this is consistent with the global pattern of urbanization, which Michael Bloomberg did not invent, nor did any of the previous mayors. It's a global pattern that begins with the birth of global financial capital. And this is what I discuss in my book. It's forthcoming. And I call it Urban Orientalism because the dominant theories and practices of urban planning around the world, which you now see in the faces of, which were born in late 19th century Europe, Victorian England, Haussmann's Paris. They're all the utopian visions of a sanitized city, a city with great mobility and accessibility, and a city that grows. These are the dominant paradigms. The design details are secondary, but the main facts come out of Haussmann's initial effort to clean up the center of Paris with all those unruly working class people who were in the habit of having revolutions, and to create the Champs-Élysées and the beautiful monumental center and sanitizing the city. Now, we're 150 years from that, but if you look around the world, how have cities been built? And as we're going into the 21st century, now the majority of the world's population lives in cities. By the year 2050, it's going to be probably around 70% living in cities, and not just any city, cities over 750,000 population, metropolitan regions. By the end of the 21st century, we may very well live in a fully urbanized world. Now, the questions that have to be asked is, by the end of the 21st century, will the rest of the world look like the cities that developed in the early part of the 20th century? What are the models? Now, the majority of the world's population does not live in the Manhattans, does not live in the global financial centers yet. But all of the large metropolitan regions that have grown spontaneously without that kind of comprehensive planning are now in the process of being transformed, from Mumbai to Rio to Lagos. Everywhere the transformation is underway. And it began in the last century with displacement, because the first thing is to displace people living in so-called slums, shanty towns. Well, the first thing you have to do is to demonize the slums, call them slums. I hate that word because it really denigrates the value of communities and neighborhoods. But it has a purpose, and the purpose is to eliminate them and turn them into the modern city, the sanitized city with the modern infrastructure. And the way this is done is through a Orientalist prejudice against the so-called unruly, chaotic cities in the world. Say Mumbai. It's unruly, it's chaotic, it's massive poverty. It can't be. You just can't have 12 million people living like that. Oh, I'm sorry, it's even more now. You have to have an organized, planned metropolitan region, and so the first elements of urban renewal, redevelopment, are taking place, and the introduction of modern infrastructure and so forth. Why is it important that we understand that here in the United States? Well, because the construction of cities is a global enterprise. We export architects, we export urban planners, we export ideas, and we export the technology, the materials, and the building supplies. So it very much matters how cities here are being built. And it very much matters how the ideas are being exported and how they're... Now, the Orientalism is a complex process because it's not a nefarious colonial process that takes place because all of these colonialist or post-colonial architects and planners are going around the world and imposing their systems. By no means. We are training architects and planners and designers all over the world in Orientalist means of urban construction, of building cities. And they themselves are the greatest advocates of this model. And what is this model as we go into the 21st century? It's enclave development, but a particular kind of enclave development. It's the enclave that's built by global financial capital. Capital being increasingly mobile, is able to move rapidly and build entire neighborhoods overnight in just about anywhere in the world. And unlike earlier processes of city building, where the capital was more personalized. In fact, when I analyzed the real estate sector in New York City, it's very clear that most of the 20th century, real estate was dominated by a small group of clans, families, large real estate clans, that at least had some local reference. Well, now what we have are real estate investment trusts, and we have equity funds that go everywhere, anytime. And what do they want to do? They want to protect their investments. So there's an even greater incentive to create an enclave, separate from the rest of the urban environment, so that it won't be contaminated by the rest of the urban environment. And so this process of enclave development, metropolitan regions increasingly built as segregated islands, begins to sound a little bit like the New York metropolitan region, but it's happening everywhere. And so does that mean it's inevitable? The final thing I want to say, and I will end with this, and I'm interested in hearing your feedback and your comments, is that there are global social movements that are advancing alternative scenarios. One of them, I think, going into the 21st century, is going to have to deal with this new phenomenon of the urbanization of the entire planet. And the contradictions are already beginning to emerge. The enterprise that capitalism began in the 19th century of dispossessing people from rural areas and building cities to create an industrial base. That process will have been relatively completed. There won't be any more rural populations. This isn't inevitable, but that's the way it's going very quickly. We're already seeing equity funds, hedge funds, moving into parts of Africa and Asia and land grabbing. They're buying small rural farms and larger rural farms and establishing industrial agriculture in the last havens of local sustainable agriculture. The factory farm will become the global reality if the current trends continue. So there are counter moves towards finding a different relationship between urban and rural areas. The social movements, the MST in Brazil is advancing a comprehensive alternative, the movement of people without land. These are farmers and urbanites who have joined together to propose a different way of integrating city and countryside and reversing the trend that capital began 150 years ago. I don't know if that's possible, but given the increasing crises of food security and the lack of food sovereignty in most countries around the world, some different way of developing our relationship to the land, to rural land, to the producers, is going to have to arise. And these ideas are already coming from the periphery, not from the center, because it's the periphery that's being pushed out. And this leads me to discuss in greater detail in the book, I don't have time to go into it all, but the need for us in cities to have a better understanding of land. And I come back to New York for sale, I come back to New York City. What do we think of when we think of land in every large city in the United States, in Europe, all of the other? We think of land as a physical space and as a 20 by 100 foot lot or a site. But the indigenous people of the world and many others, many tribal people, still retain the notion of idea and the idea that land isn't a thing. It's a set of relations. And actually, if you go more deeply into Western political economy, you'll find a similar notion. That land isn't just a physical object, that it's a set of relations. And the land in our city isn't just a site to build something on, but it's a place where people and nature, perhaps, although there's very little of nature left, engage in relationships, social relationships. And if we look at it that way, and our objective is to plan for the future of the land, then it's a very different enterprise than one that can be set down on paper as a design exercise. And that's what community planning is. It's seeking a different relationship between people and land and the institutions that are responsible for acting on that land. we also need to think about what goes on underneath the land. One of the greatest difficulties we have in New York City is that almost all of it that is not covered with buildings is covered with asphalt and concrete. Okay, we have to get over that with our green infrastructure, but this is what community planning is really doing. It's moving us towards a different notion of land, what I call community land. Community land, so if we think in terms as organizers, as community organizers and community planners, we think in terms not simply of doing a two-dimensional land use analysis, but in developing a strategy for the relationships that may occur on and around the land in the places where we live and work. That's a whole different approach. And so it is not a matter, it's not a question of legal title. It's not getting ownership of the land. And this is something that comes from within the movement as well. People are saying, well, what do we do with the title to the land? How much does that really matter? So one of the things I've been involved with in New York and nationally is the creation of community land trusts. Community land trust is a form of ownership that is community-based, so that people in a physical community have an opportunity to decide how that land gets used and developed. And it's a trust. It's a trust because the land is placed, there are limitations on the land, just like a deed restriction, that says you can only use it for people who make less than 40% of the median income. You can only use it for community garden. You can only use it for whatever community happens to decide is the appropriate use. Who's the community? That's an issue. That's a debate. Who represents that community? That's a political issue, and that's a debate. There's no absolute definition. And but the idea is that people who have a relationship with that land should have something to say in how it's used. And if their relationship is only as an investor, so that the investors from Japan are buying up properties in Lower Manhattan, their say is really peripheral. And their relationship with the land is really perfect. They really don't have a relationship to the land. Their relationship is to their money. So the idea of a community land trust is that the community, people who have that direct relationship have some long-term stake in determining the future of that land. Now, community, I also happen to be on the board of directors of the Cooper Square Community Land Trust, which was one of the first to be created in New York City. And it started 50 years ago when a group of tenants organized to stop the redevelopment of their neighborhood and its conversion from low-income housing to middle-income housing under a Robert Moses plan. It was the Cooper Square plan. And the community did their own plan, the Cooper Square plan. And they fought for 50 years to get it accepted by the city and to get the housing they wanted built, and to preserve the existing housing instead of the city going in and knocking it down. And the land trust is a way of guaranteeing that those units, which are now, the average unit is occupied by somebody earning 40% of the area median income, or less. And it's a way of preserving that. And why is this important? because successive waves of gentrification have destroyed a whole population of limited equity cooperatives that emerged in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, financed by the city, because they sold out. They weren't protected. The tenants were able to vote and sell their apartments to the highest bidder, make a profit. Good for them. But we lost affordable housing, and the result has been a gentrified neighborhood. So these new kinds of relationships to land are really important. It's not just the land trust. There are other ways of gaining control of land. State ownership, city or state ownership, you would think is one way of protecting land, but it's not always. Very often, it's unreliable, and the state is too willing to sell off its land when it becomes valuable in the marketplace. So state ownership by itself isn't necessarily the solution. And we have much publicly owned land in the city, but as Occupy Wall Street has begun to teach us, not all publicly owned land is publicly accessible. And indeed, this goes back to our Orientalist planning traditions, starting with Central Park, where the parks were developed as places to domesticate the working class, to teach them how to behave like good middle class people, and not to play ball on the lawn, not to do this and not to do that, and so public ownership by itself doesn't give us the right to the city, doesn't give us the right city either. But private ownership also by itself doesn't automatically take us away from it. What kind of private ownership? And how is it constrained? And here I go back to our silly little zoning laws, which are means of land use control. And so this is also an important objective of community-based planning, is that people understand the land use controls and gain control of them. And my profession, city planning profession, which is the second oldest profession in the world, has rigged it so that very few people really understand zoning. It's a huge, complicated regulatory system, and it's filled with jargon and names and words that people don't understand. It's actually very simple, but it's obscured, and it's a way of retaining power in the hands of the executive authorities and preventing people in their neighborhoods and communities from gaining control. So these are all important ways, different ways of building community land, promoting community land. Community land is a strategic concept. It's a way of getting people to think about land in a different way. That it's not just about an individual building in your neighborhood. It's not just about a park, or it's not just about a single issue. It's about, it's a strategic concept of thinking strategically, comprehensively. And you know what? can do it. Average, everyday people can do it. I've seen it happen. I'm inspired by it. When I go to community planning meetings, people are absolutely outraged at what's been happening to their neighborhoods, and they come up with incredibly beautiful utopian ideas of what their neighborhood should be. Maybe they're dreaming too much, I don't know, but they're certainly capable of it. The great Orientalist myth of the 19th century was that the only people that could have those utopian dreams were the engineers and the architects, the housemans, who could apply their rational, deterministic psychology to the urban terrain. And community-based planning is a way, is of democratizing planning and showing that really everybody, and in the 21st century, unless everybody becomes a planner, we very well may have global climate change may force cities into a new catastrophic future. So I think it really is incumbent that everybody be a planner and be an urbanist, and people can be. In fact, the history of cities, right from the earliest human settlements, is that people have applied their own ideas to the built environment and made their own cities. And not just the professionals. So, throughout history, all of our cities have been built. In fact, most housing in cities around the world, this is changing, but most housing in cities around the world is self-built. It's not built by architects. So, people can apply their consciousness to the built environment. And what we have to do is to overcome the obstacle that says that you can't dream about a better future, and you can't engage in that because you don't know the rules of the game. So start local, but be global, and if you think globally, you'll be able to think and act locally as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I have actually the luxury of 2 microphones, which I think will be very useful. I'm going to pass the slide so perhaps that you can manage your way in the microphones around, and I'm going to handle one as such. It was a very provocative lecture. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. What was expected, so it's on its way. I was very surprised of these, I mean not surprised actually, of the emphasis you've taken in the second book. Well, not second, but so the other side of New York for Sale, I would say, I guess that's why I refer to the second side, which is that the global scale that you're thinking of the Orientalism as such. And one of the things that have impressed me the most about understanding how contemporary urbanization is playing was my first encounter with one of these hugely impossible to read policy documents produced by the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which currently studies, I think, 78 cities around the world. And it's basically one of these think tanks from the World Bank and IMF's and development that advises cities on how to grow, on how to, basically how to distribute capital to them, how to become centers of foreign direct investment as such. And I was incredibly surprised that when I read that this first report was perhaps 6 years ago, and it was a report that was produced by the early 2000s. And in these early 2000s, they were already suggesting the drive of cities to enter into a very concentrated phase of inter-urban competition. There were actually, it was called a Project for City Competitiveness, and they were giving a series of transcriptions on how cities should compete for foreign direct investment, setting themselves mostly as a parameter for development in Europe. Most of European cities, I would argue, all perhaps of the main middle-sized European cities follow this prescription in the letter frames. But one of the things that they were saying, of course, is that that it's no longer local control. What you were saying, it was not the Rockefellers, which had some sort of rootedness over here, which not to say that it was a good or bad thing, but it was it happened. But it was mostly laying out the game for foreign direct investment to control sort of how cities grow and how investment is produced as such. But one of the things that impressed me the most was that they were already prescribing in that report the necessity of democratic development, of what they called at the time participatory development, community development. That it was a need for local governments, in the case of, let's talk about any city in Madrid or Barcelona or whatever the sort of cities in Europe, Dublin, to begin to engage through social activists, through architects, into the process of community participation, because democratic decision in the production of the city was very important. Now, what they were thinking there is that they went into the experience that a lot of big development projects had been stopped by a lot of community. Paris is a very good example, England, I mean, there's many examples, New York, no question about it. There's been a lot of community organization that has stopped these projects. So part of these recommendations dealt with the idea that if you, as a city, enable since the beginning some sort of charade where people are engaged in the production of these new foreign direct investments, there will be less resistance and therefore much easier entry for foreign direct capital within. Now the question goes here, in your experience as community planner, have you received already much more reception in that round from the city of New York in this case, of sort of trying to negotiate with you as community planners larger development, and in which way has these community planning processes prepared for this other phase of foreign capital, neoliberal capital trying to actually take over under the name of democratic sort of participation, which we are already seeing in this waterfront development plan as such. Complicated question. After this question, I will open it to the room.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. The World Bank is out there talking about participatory planning, and you listen to them, and they're in countries where local governments are putting the lid on participation, and crushing neighborhoods and just moving in and bulldozing people. And the World Bank is saying, what is this? They're the heroes. Well, yeah, it's because they see it's a way of getting the mega projects through, where national governments are often too brutal and not sophisticated. This is a way around them. And the pattern, though, is global. Plan YC 2030, New York City's long-term sustainability plan, is one indication. The Bloomberg administration is actually quite expert on this. The process of engaging community participation. If you ask them, they will say, of course we want participation. We invite it. We'll come and talk to you. When do you want to meet? We'll send our people. And they'll listen to you, and they'll take notes, and everything, and then they'll go back, and then they'll do whatever they wanted to do in the first place. That's how Plan YC, and you can read my paper on Plan YC 2030, which I said is advertised as a long-term sustainability plan. It's not long-term, it's not sustainable, and it's not a plan. It's a growth plan. It's a way of rationalizing, and I document this, They started out with the prediction, based on no science at all, that there would be 1 million new people in New York City by the year 2030. Well, if you start with that premise, then you have to build for another 1 million people, and it just sort of, it's a signal to the growth machine to, you know, expand the city. And then if you have all those, so the modus operandus is to invite participation, in fact, to kill you with participation. You'll have so much, now, we worked with folks in Harlem who were fighting the rezoning of Harlem. And you want to see a great documentary, rezoning, called Rezoning Harlem, by a couple of our students at Hunter. The chair of the City Planning Commission, Amanda Burden, is quoted as saying, well, I had 400 meetings with people in Harlem before this rezoning plan was approved. She may be right, I don't know. But they probably did have 400 meetings. And they just smiled people to death. And then they passed the plan that they wanted in the first place. Maybe with a few minor modifications, but by and large, that's the way you do it. So when people ask me, oh, you believe in community planning and participation? No, I don't. I don't believe in participation. Participation by itself is neither good nor bad. It doesn't make any difference. In fact, in this city, we had too much participation and not enough democracy.
I'm going to try to do some stack. If you guys have questions, I have number 1 here. 2.
Okay. I recently been to a meeting of the New York Regional Planning Agency, NIMTIC, and made a presentation about their new bike sharing program. And it seemed like they have a set fare, I mean set price for using the system. You can have a daily, monthly, or annual rate. But it's a flat rate, and it doesn't have any gradations for people of lower income. And it seems like it serves more of a higher income people. When you calculate it, it's twice the amount of you pay for your subway metro card. So it made me think of what would be the community planning here, because the community planning that you talked about is more local based or place based. In such a situation, in transportation mode planning, bikes, having access to bikes should be the right of everyone and all that. There has a lot of equity considerations. But how do you engage community participation in such an extent when it's not local based or when it's not place based? It's more of a region. This is my question.
Well, it's a good question. And here's the problem. It is place based. And unfortunately, the city doesn't have a place based strategy. Its strategy is we have a bicycle master plan, which I, by the way, participated in the technical committee to produce the master plan. I think it's great. I think we need to have more bicycle lanes all over the city. I think bike share is a good step forward. But what's happening on the ground is the bicycle lanes are going in those communities where the merchants are in favor, or they're at least not violently opposed, or where there's a big bike community. And all the rest of the city, which is mostly the outer boroughs, where there are lots of bicyclists. The invisible bicyclists, many invisible bicyclists. Last year, I taught a year-long urban planning studio on bicycle planning in New York City. Students went out, they counted all of these bicyclists in Flushing. Queens, well, mostly immigrant cyclists. And Flushing has very few bicycle lanes, very little bicycle parking, very little infrastructure. It really ought to have it. Why doesn't it? Go to the community board meeting. Community Board 7 in Queens is run by mostly white guys who drive. and who have garages and who park their cars, and for whom bicycles are an annoyance. Okay, so it is place-based. It's very much place-based. DOT, I'm sure, would be happy to put bicycle lanes in Flushing. But if they did, the first thing they would encounter would be not in my backyard.
I was talking more about fair setting practices as a challenge for community organization.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's going to be a problem with bike share. I heard from somebody in DOT that they're talking about an arrangement with public housing tenants to be able to, because right now you need a credit card in order to use bike share. So for people who don't have credit cards.
I guess, thanks so much for your talk. I guess I have a couple more political questions. The first being, so what do you think was the single worst rezoning under the leadership of Speaker Quinn? And do you think that she'll have a similar record to Bloomberg if she becomes mayor, with an emphasis on rezoning? And I guess the second question is, who do you think are the politicians in the city who are fighting against overdevelopment, besides people like Charles Barron and Tony Abella, if you can think of others?
Well, probably there are a lot of bad rezonings, but the worst was in Williamsburg, in Brooklyn. It was a crushing defeat for community planning because Williamsburg and Greenpoint spent 15 years doing their community plan with the main objective of keeping luxury high-rise off the waterfront. Their plan included low to mid-rise residential and mixed commercial and industrial development on the waterfront, kind of like what already exists in Williamsburg. They spent 15 years doing the plan. It was officially approved. 2 years later, city planning comes in with this rezoning plan to put luxury high-rise on the waterfront. This was an insult to the community. And they wheeled and dealed for a long time. They threw out some crumbs, and they had participation until until people got exhausted, and they got their rezoning. And that was a devastating thing, because if you look at today, Williamsburg is being gentrified. Industry, city planning invented zoning scams, and they used them all in Williamsburg. They've used them in other places. One of the scams is, we're going to put affordable housing on the waterfront, okay? So, okay, you're going to have high rises, but you're going to get affordable housing. Well, inclusionary zoning involves a voluntary 20% increase in floor area if 20% of units are affordable. Affordable to who? They're affordable based on the area-wide median income, which is twice the median income of Williamsburg, which means they're not affordable to those people who now live in Williamsburg. So that was the first scam. The next scam was mixed-use zoning. Oh, we've got this great zone. You can have either industry or housing. And people say, oh, wow, that's what we want. We want to keep this walk-to-work neighborhood. The great planning vision is, oh, wow, walk to work. The problem is, it's voluntary also. It's up to the landowner to decide whether they want industrial or residential. Well, if you own land in gentrifying Williamsburg, and you can get 10 times more rent out of a residential tenant than you can off of an industrial tenant, what are you going to do? So the industry went away, and that was the mixed-use scam. And then the final scam was the waterfront access scam. Oh, you're going to get luxury high-rises, but the waterfront zoning requires a 25-foot public promenade on the waterfront. So look, the Parks Department doesn't have any money. They're not going to build a waterfront park. So this is the way you're going to get waterfront open space. Well, that's a lie. Parks Department is investing. They're building a new golf course out in the Bronx. What the hell? So the problem is that it's the Battery Park City model of open space. It's the backyard for the tenants of and the condo owners in the luxury high-rises. So that's the waterfront access scam. And they all happened in Williamsburg. I think another one that we fought against was the Lower East Side, East Village, because it left out a large portion of Chinatown where there's overdevelopment, and it left out public housing, which is now threatened by redevelopment. And it preserved, and the Furman Center did an excellent study that confirmed what we all know, that out of the more than 100 rezonings that the Bloomberg administration has done, most of the upzonings for promoting new development were in gentrifying neighborhoods, communities of color, low-income communities of color, and most of the downzonings, which preserved neighborhoods, were in white communities outside the center, where there is very little pressure for real estate development. And then the final answer is bring back a Tony Abella and Charles Brown. They're the main people who had really stood up against the zoning scams. The Progressive Caucus has raised some issues, but by and large I don't see anybody else doing it, and Christine Quinn at this point seems to be going the same way as her predecessor, if she becomes mayor.
Hi, thank you for this talk. Speaking about public housing, I currently live in Mitchellama Housing, Southbridge Towers down by the seaport, and we're in the middle of a giant privatization battle because we have an entire community, an entire building board is against us. And it was against just the idea of turning it all private, but beyond that, it's just that I've now reached the point where I just feel so disconnected from the whole political system. Like, I try to go to community board meetings and I try to get involved in these motions, but what are your recommendations on really getting out there into the system? Because I find it so hard, because when you go to the community board meetings, they mostly seem like an entire gentleman's club of people who own businesses, restaurants, all in the area, landlords, mostly talking about more aesthetics than actual meat and potatoes, for lack of a better metaphor. But, and I just find myself just further and further, and with this whole privatization thing, I just feel like, literally, if that's yanked, then I question where my family, which we have like so much of my family living in one building complex, that if that goes, then where do we go? It's just like this whole, I never thought that I would envision ourselves as displaced in the Manhattan, essentially enclave.
Okay. Well, did you have a question?
Oh no, I was just wondering recommendations on really getting into the system and really how to weave yourself into it. It's like, because I just find it just troubling that we live in a democratic society, yet the channels seem to be so high up and so blocked up.
Well, yeah, and community boards are the local form of government, but we have 59 community boards. Their average budget is around $200,000 each. A couple of staff people. They have less than 0.003% of the total city budget together, taken together. So that's how much is spent on local democracy. And it's amazing that any community boards actually end up doing good things, but they do, some do. But it's a very top-down system. It's an imperial mayoralty, and the agencies are extremely powerful. And this mayor has allowed agencies to take a great deal of initiative as long as they don't embarrass him. And so I think there's a fundamental, structural, systemic problem. But until people get together and organize and demand change, I don't see that that's going to change. I mean, there are a lot of good people that work in community boards, that are on community boards, but there's a structural problem. They lack the staff, they lack the financing, there are no clear criteria for a democratic process to select community board members. Many community boards are not representative of their constituencies. There are huge discrepancies in age, ethnicity, gender, all across the board, because nobody pays attention.
So 4 was, and we're going to end with you because we're using too much of.
Thank you very much. I have a quick question, or maybe not. The question is quick. What are in your experience, better tactics for revealing some of the contradictions that you've come across? For instance, if you're looking at and analyzing a comprehensive plan and the contradictions are just all over the place, how would you reveal that, and to whom?
The contradictions of the plan?
Yeah.
Of a plan.
Of a plan.
Well, very often, I work in communities where people already get it. People kind of understand that they're being played on, and that's when they call me, and more of what I do is confirm it, or not. But to say, yeah, this is what they're doing. These are the contradictions, and a lot of what we do together is strategize and try to figure out how you can insert yourself, if you're a community, organization, or group, in that contradictory environment and get a different outcome. So my approach is very Freirean. I believe in working with communities, not for communities, working in partnership as equals. It's a learning process for both of us, and I think that's what's missing also in government, where the attitude is usually paternalistic. It's like, we are the technicians, we have the answers for you. Or it's, we're here to listen to you, which is all bullshit, just, we're here to listen to what you have to say, and it's more therapy than it is democracy.
Last question.
Hi. I thought your message about community land was really hopeful, but I wondered if you had any fears or suspicions about the future of community land trusts, if you could maybe corroborate a rumor I heard that land was being purchased by banks for community land trusts, particularly in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and that maybe there were some sort of implications of that. If you've come across anything of that nature in your experience.
I haven't heard of that, but I don't know why a bank would buy it to put it in a land trust. Unless it was a tax dodge or something, they're putting it into a trust so they don't have to pay taxes on it. I don't know. But, you know, there are groups, organizations who are talking about occupying vacant buildings, vacant land, and trying to get them into land trusts. Going to banks like Citibank that own a lot of vacant properties, and get them to deed it to a land trust, with the idea that they can be community-based land trusts that local people can decide what to do with them. It would certainly be better than having the land and the buildings sit for decades, which has happened in the past. Certainly be more productive.
Thank you very much. Thanks. There seems to be a party out there.
Yes.
Yeah. Don't forget, our next lecture is Don Mitchell, which those of you that don't know, it's a fantastic geographer from Syracuse that's been writing a lot and right to the city, homelessness, and all this type of stuff. Quite a popular guy. Hope to see you here.